we look forward to this time of fellowship, but also instruction. As to how we can implement these things into your church. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Come. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. I can't believe you came on a Monday. It's just Did that do it? Beautiful. We're green. So anyways, as I was saying, the people who normally have their day off on Monday, and if you're here, I don't know, you get a 5-star award, I don't know, or you get what kind of award, but I grew up as a PK too, and my dad always took his day off on Monday. And I never have taken my day off on Monday. To me, it's always been best for me just to dive back in and then that's not what we're here to talk about. But anyways, you're the heroes today, so thanks for being here. Got a Bills fan, apparently. Are you from Buffalo?
My wife is, and we're moving to Buffalo. This is the missionary I was telling you.
Oh, good. So we need to talk. Beautiful. Yeah, we're not far from...
One of the deacons here was going to be representing the Chiefs, so...
Oh, really?
So we had to rub that in.
Oh, no, that's okay. Is there... Yeah, I mean, that game changed the NFL forever. You guys know that, right? The whole overtime thing is like reversed now. That was beautiful.
The Chiefs didn't whine when it happened to them 2 years ago.
Yeah. No, we're not. We'll be progressively sanctified in other ways today. Let's take our Bibles to Colossians real quickly this morning, if you have those with you. And did I leave mine back there on the shelf? I did, Caleb. Could you bring that when we were working on the PowerPoint? Colossians chapter 4. And we're going to look at, real quickly, just verses 2 through 6. And this is just a little 5-minute opening devotional to kind of get our hearts set. Thanks, Simeon. Okay? This is a text that the Lord used in the life of our church about 20 years ago, to this text and a couple others, to reset our minds towards what really a disciple-making church is. We're going to look at verses 4, 2 through 6 for just a couple minutes, but if we'll go back here to verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2, this to me is a springboard. You guys understand the purpose for this book, the author, the purpose, the telos of this text, and its representation of who Christ is. And you understand chapters 1 and 2 are very much the doctrinal portion, as Paul would write, and 3 and 4 the practical portion, the application of the theology, if you will. There's one statement here of the nature of who Jesus Christ is. His nature. Paul says here, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather, that according to Christ. For in him, this is the statement of his nature. This is what Jesus can't help himself but be as the Logos of God, right? For in him, all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. The word fullness here, if you understand that, the language of the New Testament, is just really full to overflowing. Jesus Christ is the effervescence, if you will, of deity in bodily form. And Jesus said that, didn't he, in his earthly ministry? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Okay? Understanding that, among other things that Paul says here in chapter 1, when I take the understanding of his nature and I begin to apply that to the practical portion of this book in chapter 3 and chapter 4, there's enough of Jesus to go around in our daily living. We will never have too much or too little of Jesus to apply to our daily living. Because he's still the effervescence of his Father. Right? And how that fleshes itself out is personally in the first part of chapter 3. You folks know that. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, verse number 5. I really believe when you get down to verse 12 of chapter 3, it goes into not just a personal, but a corporate, a body application, a body of Christ application. Whether you believe this or not, my personal understanding of verses 12 to 17 is really of a corporate worship context. There's a lot of valuable things going on there that I can see happening in the context of when the body gathers. So personally and then corporately, we're able to know Christ, live Christ, apply Christ to our personal lives and into the way we worship. And then domestically, verse 18, there's enough of Christ, if you will, without being irreverent, to bring application to what it means to live Christ-like in our homes. And then vocationally, verses 22 through chapter 4 and verse 1, the application of Christ to our jobs, where we spend 40 to 80 hours a week, depending on the nature of your industry, the demands of your industry. So personally, corporately, domestically, vocationally, and then there's still enough of Christ to overflow into chapter 4, verses 2 through 6, which to me is evangelistically. So none of us are going to have an argument. We're not going to sit here and debate about whether Christ should be demonstrated in our personal lives, whether Christ should be preached or lived in our worship lives, or the same with our homes, the same with our jobs. But why did Christ come also? And that's very clear in verses 2 through 6. There's three main present active imperatives, three main verbs in chapter 4 that are, to me, not options, right? They're imperatives, they're commands. The first one is in verse 2, the second one in verse 5, and the third in verse 6. All three of these commands are really guardrails, if you will, and how we're going to apply Christ to our personal lives again, right? So it starts personal in chapter 3. I think he's going to end personally here. As we go into the community, the text is going to tell us everyone in our flock has to draw the circle around themselves, starting with the leadership first. We've got to step into the community very intentionally with still enough time left in our week to be able to do this. Time management's huge here, right? We all only have 168 hours in our week, right? We've got a personal ministry, worship, time for home, time for work, and yet there still has to be time to apply Christ to how we live in our communities for His sake. And the foundation of this first verb is prayer. You're going to see that in verse number 2, devote yourselves to prayer. And then you're going to see it re-emphasized on a couple different levels there, and you can study that out on your own time. Certainly, it's always done with thanksgiving. And then a participle there in verse 3, praying at the same time for us as well, that God would open up to us a door for the word for this purpose, right? Little hina clause there in the Greek language, so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ. We've got to be able to personally take ownership of this. Now, you know Paul's writing this from prison, but I think it's fascinating. There's no direct address to the pastor teacher of this church in this letter. This is a letter written to the body. So this is something that everyone, whether they're in spiritual leadership or not, is to take ownership of. So they're to pray. right? Not just for their own personal evangelistic opportunity, but also for the evangelistic opportunity of others. That's what Paul's asking them to do for him. And then verse 5, conduct yourselves with wisdom towards who? There's that evangelistic word towards outsiders. That's that Pauline insiders, outsiders. These are unsaved people. Conduct your way. I think that's a very strong verb, coupled with wisdom. This is just an imperative that teaches us that we ought not to be bending our personal holy code of conduct in order to reach the lost. You don't have to do that, right? You just go live godly while you love and have compassion on the lost. And that is backed with prayer, right? So prayer really is the catalyst to your personal holy living out in town as you build redemptive relationships with these sweet lost people. And then it says here, making the most of every opportunity, and that word does mean to be opportunistic. So prayer is very much going to provide for us if we're going to obey. In praying, if we're going to obey in going with holy character, and we're going to interface with, in a meaningful, loving way, lost people, the text says here, God will give opportunity. It's not a matter of if. It is a matter of when. Okay? And you see that. Some of you that have purposed in your heart to make this a matter of consistent prayer and a matter of consistent conducting, right? According to wisdom. You've seen God answer that prayer over and over and over, right? There's nothing of the reality of harvest in this text. This whole context is imperatival. It's not our job to be the Lord of the harvest. It's our job to obey. The glory is in the obedience. Okay? When God gives fruit is His business. We certainly can seek to persuade. We can certainly give the ask. We'll talk about that throughout the next 14 hours together. But the beauty for me is that this little pericope is really imperatively driven. Just obey. Pray, conduct, and then relate, right? Verse 6, let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt. And there's another purpose clause, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. It sounds a little bit like 1 Peter 3:15 to me. You'll know how to, right, that apologia, that little defense. But we always use that in terms of debate, and I don't know that I've ever debated the gospel with a lost person. I don't know that there's anything to debate. But at least there's a relationship here that opens up a door to speak the sufficiency of Christ in your own life to their life, right? And it's a command. So obviously, we're not allowed to not have a relationship with lost people. Does that make sense? Like we're not allowed to not have a relationship with a lost person. It says here it's a command. You got to go, conduct, speak. That's a relationship. Right? And the word salt here just doesn't have the typical gospel or New Testament analogy or analysis or metaphorical usage. It just means to be salty. And in my home, when my kids use the word salty, that's not necessarily a good thing, right? It's not to be sarcastic here. As the Colossian believers would have heard this from the Apostle Paul, they would have heard this as being conversational, being able to converse about multiple topics. Right? So it's not an idea of healing or a balm or, it's just be conversational. And that kind of ties with this word opportunity or opportunistic, right? So you've got to be ready. So I was reared in an environment where this was not a way of life. Everything I'm going to say about as we move forward into our history here, I don't believe our history is in your notes, so you can just kind of listen along. This was not, this text was compartmentalized into our context instead of our context looking back to what it really was and being able to live it. So we did this pretty much 3 times a year, when we would have Vacation Bible School, when we would have a Christmas program, and we would have an Easter outreach. Okay? This was not a lifestyle for us. So we were not, it was not modeled for us as kids and as young adults that this was a lifestyle, 24/7, 365. Okay? As a matter of fact, we were taught from the book of James that friendship with the world is enmity with God. That you should not have friends. Now, right, we can do all things through a verse out of context. I get that. A lot of these things were part of our history, and I love my history. I stand on the shoulders of some really good men, but I'm going to make some qualifying statements here along the way. I'm very thankful for the way I was reared. I'm very thankful for my father, who never had a spiritual mentor in his life, but was a pastor for 35 years. By the time he was done, 42 years. And I'm thankful how he learned from God how to love the lost, because he never had a mentor. So I was being brought up in a Christian environment that you'll hear of here in a little bit, that really wasn't doing this text except for those 3 times a year. I was taught, coupled with the book of James, chapter 1, that if you spend too much time with ungodly kids, you're going to be an ungodly person, right? Evil companions do what? They corrupt good morals, so don't have unsafe friends. That was the syllogistic logic approach. You just, this, well then certainly don't have unsafe friends. You can have acquaintances, right? You do your evangelism through acquainting, not friending. Okay? Didn't really take a look much at John 17:15-17, which is Christ's high priestly prayer. He prays for us, Lord, don't take them out of the world, but do what with them? Leave them there, but sanctify them by thy truth, because thy word is truth. Okay? There's something of how we learn the word of God personally and how we shepherd one another scripturally in the local church that prepares us to go and continue to be holy out there with those outsiders that we were not familiar with. Okay? So we need to be preparing ourselves to know how to respond to each person, and I know that's probably why you're here on a Monday when you should be at home with your wife and kids. Anyways, she's probably a wonderful person. Yes, and you're going to probably have to take another day this week, right? By the way, that's a really cool desk. Where did you get that? Walmart. Of course you did. Do you bring that to church with you every week, or is it just to classes? It's brand new, just for today?
I bought it so I could have it for today.
That's a really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. The PSL's permanent seat license. Gonna pay $50 a year for that spot. No, it's just kidding. All right. So anyways, that's a little devotional, some devotional thoughts to warm up our minds and our hearts to where we're headed, really, is for each of us to take ownership of the reality of the nature of who Christ is and how we live him. There must be enough time and energy, capacity with each one of us to be able to live these imperatives after we live all the imperatives of chapter 3, which are plenty. Does that make sense? Everyone always love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But every one of us has a different physical, mental, emotional capacity. Right? I've got guys on my staff that can go 80, 90 hours a week and still love their wives well and love their kids well and work well and love their community well. And there's guys that have a hard time doing 40. and to not make any other part of their life spiritually expendable. Okay? Everyone has a different capacity. But within the capacity that God created you with, these imperatives need to be done, right? Without making any one of the other expendable in the process, all right? So, on the top of your notes, you can write this little proposition because I have people write it instead of it being written in here. I don't think it's written in here. This is propositionally where we would like to go for the rest of our time today and tomorrow. Okay, we're going to stop at noon for lunch. If you need to take a break between now and then, feel free. We just kind of keep moving. Hopefully it's not a drink from a fire hose, but I don't know that it can't be that. We'll absorb as much as we possibly can, all right? If disciple making is biblical, this is the proposition. Or should I say, since it's biblical, we'll make it this conditional statement. Since disciple making is biblical, it must be doable by each believer in any size church in any culture. Since disciple making is biblical, it must be accomplished or done by each believer in any size church in any culture. Okay? And we don't have you put blanks down there. I think we just remember more of what we hear and what we actually write, and we fully see what we write. And I want you to remain open and transparent about that proposition as to whether you even agree with it or not. I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm saying this is what we're going to teach. But the day I stop being a learner is the day really I think God's done with me. I always want to be a learner, lover, and worshiper. This is where we're at today. You know, a little over 20 years since we began exploring this whole reality of what we hope to be and think to be the will of God for our lives personally, and then the will of God for our body in Mentor, Ohio, okay? And if it's the will of God, then I want to make sure that this statement's propositionally true, so you can help me with that, okay? And I will not be offended. I will be offended if you're thinking something that you really want to say and you don't say it, and I find out later, and then you let me tell all these people falsehood. Okay. All right, we beat that dead horse enough. All right, let's keep going. So this is true of our history and grace. So we're going to go back a little bit in our history, because I really am finding out no matter where we do the seminar in this country or out of the country that there's some similarities in each one of our backgrounds that we'll see. All right. So we'll go through this as quickly as we can. We were a church plant of the GRBC, the Ohio arm of it, in 1948. We had 5 pastors in that time span. My dad was the longest standing pastor that Grace Baptist Church ever had, okay? And that was 35 years. It was actually 35. It wasn't 34. Maybe it was 34. He stayed on for a transition year, so that's probably where I'm getting the 35th. He was a Moody Bible Institute grad. As I said before, never had a spiritual mentor in his life. He grew up in Middlefield, Ohio, on a farm, was an athletic dude, went to Kent State University on a dual scholarship of basketball and track, and came to know the Lord as his Savior. As a freshman there at Kent State University, having taught Sunday school as an unsaved high schooler at his congregational church in Burton, Ohio, he never knew Christ. And he lived like he didn't know Christ. So lived like the devil on Saturday and do something different on Sunday. But he truly came to know Christ at Kent State. And he put down his basketball scholarship. He quit it, and his track scholarship. That's what he just felt. He was everything that a high school and college Jock was off the court, right? And God changed him. And at that particular point, that was right for him in his life. It was good for him to step aside because he didn't know in his life, in his testimony, how to separate the lifestyle from the sport. So that was what was good for him. So he stepped aside. He finished his undergrad degree in teaching science at Kent State University, and he went on up to Kenston, Ohio, in Geauga County, and he taught high school science and coached basketball there. So this would have been early 1960s. He's doing this, having been saved at Kent State, just devouring the Word, not really even having a consistent local church to go to, let alone someone to spiritually mentor him. He was really convicted that Genesis 1 and 2 were true. And so he taught that as a theory, even though he knew it to be true by faith, in Kenston High School in the early 60s, and they dismissed him. Even way back then, even in a rural farm town of Geauga County. But God used that to continue to lead him to people that would help him know that when he was born again, that God gifted him by his manifold grace with the pastor-teacher gift. So God's using all these experiences with no mentor to direct his life. Okay? He started taking classes at Cleveland Baptist Institute, CBI, in Euclid, Ohio. That's where he met my mom. They got married. And she grew up in a Christian home. My dad did not. I would say was not actively Christian home, right? So my grandpa, my dad's dad, was the head usher at Old Moody Church under Harriet Ironside, right? And my dad's uncle was the head of what they used to call coal portage or coal portering at Moody. And that was an old-fashioned word for outreach, visitation, evangelism. So my Uncle Dana, my great-uncle Dana, who passed away at 99, he was under Ironside that whole time as his director of outreach. And my grandpa was the head usher, but when my grandpa's dad died in a tragic farming accident, that's what you did when you're the oldest fellow in the home. You go back home and take care of the farm, and my grandma was just a cold atheist and just turned him away from everything. And was my grandpa saved? I really don't know. I really don't know. When my dad told him he was going into ministry, he said, "You're not welcome in this house." So he turned from head usher under Ironside to that. And I only saw my grandpa warm up back to things of the Lord when my dad and I made a front page of the local county newspaper as a ministry team. And my grandpa was a man of very few words. We walked in for a visit, and he took the newspaper, rolled up, and he threw it at us, and he goes, "That's nice." That's all he said, right? So, okay, maybe a little sign of fresh air there. But anyways, that was the environment my dad grew up in, and my grandpa passed away at 84, and I hope he's with the Lord. I do believe my grandma was saved, and she went to Huntsburg Baptist Church until the day she died. But my grandpa was a really hard dude, and it was a really hard life for my grandma, but she persevered as best she could. But that's what my dad grew up with, okay? My dad was ordained in the early 70s of the JRBC in Ohio. At his ordination service, they were all garb pastors. The last question of his ordination service is, would you be willing to pastor a church that did not have the name Baptist on the church sign? And my dad was just unmentored, really relatively unshepherded, except for his professors at Moody. Kind of green, he's thinking through, and he had never been told the wise, if you don't know the answer to a question in ordination, just say, "I don't know." But he said, "I suppose if my doctrinal statement, right, didn't change and nothing else was changing," he said, "I suppose a little paint on a church sign doesn't really matter much." And he told me that 2/3 of the guys in that ordination got up and walked out. And thankfully, the third that was left signed his ordination certificate, and he was ordained. His first church after ordination was Pleasant Valley Road Baptist Church in Parma, Ohio. And this was the year that Billy Graham was coming to town for the first time in Cleveland's history. And the Graham Crusade at that point had reached out to over 150 Catholic churches in that area and asked those Catholic churches to work with them in giving the gospel out to people who would come forward in the invitation. My dad's heart at that point wasn't comfortable with that. Unmentored, he just said, I just don't see this. God just led him to 2 Corinthians 6:14 to 7:1 as a young pastor, and he said, this just doesn't resonate with me, so we're going to have our own evangelistic outreach. He didn't say no. My dad was really good at, if he could say no, he always provided a yes, and so the church was going to do their own evangelistic outreach because he didn't want to join with unbelief in giving out the gospel in a worship service. That was just his conviction. So the church, he taught the church seemed to be good. He went away on a week's vacation. When he came back from his week's vacation, there were Billy Graham posters up all over the walls. And apparently the church had changed their mind in the week that he was gone, and he resigned that church after being there for just south of 2 years. And then he came over to Grace Baptist Church in Willoughby, and then 17 people in that little tiny white church voted him in as the pastor in 1972. Okay? Any questions about the journey so far? Right? Right. How are you feeling, brother? Are you fully recovered? You look great. You know we almost lost this guy to COVID. Are you in any side effects or?
I got a good report from the CT scan a couple of weeks ago, and so doing good.
Praise God. I just saw you sitting there. I just had to stop. I apologize. I don't know if this guy's head was blocking you or whatnot, but I was so focused in on the guy taking his day off to be here. I just been distracted ever since. It's really good to see you. Wow. Anyways, we all lost friends your age in the last 2 years, and it's just kind of overwhelmingly, it's overwhelming. It's good to have you still with us. All right. 1976, the GARB in our area was going what I would, all I can say is my dad's conviction in the early 70s, you're going to say, well, your dad was just a guy full of convictions, wasn't he? He's like, well, he kind of was, but where he stood, understanding he didn't have a spiritual mentor was pretty profound as I look back in the rearview mirror. He was just really a man of the word and spent a ton of time in prayer, and God molded him. And I'll speak just for our neck of the woods in the 70s. I'm not speaking for any other area of this association, right? It was a decided fact of church philosophy in Northeast Ohio for churches in the GARB at that time to my dad would say it was like inviting more of the world into the church instead of taking the church to the world. That was the decision. It was an executive decision of the Ohio arm to do this. Okay? And that included not just bringing unsaved people into the church, that included bringing what unsaved people enjoy into the church. Okay? So it became, to my dad at that point, a new pragmatism. And to my dad, it was kind of like, the ends don't justify the means. In other words, if the end is the salvation of a soul, that doesn't give us, or me, the right at Grace Baptist Church to justify any means I can use to get them into the church so the church can save them. So, my dad was not a cut off the arm easy kind of guy. He needed friends. He wanted friends. He had no mentors. Like I stated that again and again. He really craved friendship. He was a lover of people, but he was a lover of God more. And so this is just his resolute conviction. I don't know that you guys want me to be part of your group anymore because I'm not going to do that. And so he pulled out of the GARB in 1976. Stayed friends with many folks in the garb. In 1980, our church paint on the sign did change. After he came out of the garb in 1981 from Grace Baptist Church to Grace Church of Mentor, and the doctrinal statement didn't change. Right? So when he took Baptist off the sign, he pretty much emptied the few friends that he did have out of his life. I'm just telling you our history. That's it. Okay? All right. This is true of this decade. My dad attached his fellowship to a group of men in the Ohio Bible Fellowship. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ohio Bible Fellowship or not, but this was a group of 17 churches that all used to be part of the IFCA National. And these 17 churches were the Ohio Regional of the IFCA. In 1968, the executive board of the IFCA decided that they were never going to print any more articles in their magazine called The Voice on what was known to be, I still believe it to be, the biblical doctrine of separation. So these 17 men called on the executive branch of the IFCA National and contended, and they did not agree that there could be no more articles written in The Voice on that topic. They had the director of the IFCA National come out to Ohio, and they asked his audience, and he came, and that didn't go well, and so they pulled out of the IFCA and started the Ohio Bible Fellowship in 1968, right? You say, how do you know all this stuff? Well, I grew up in the OBF, and when I was finishing my Master of Divinity degree, one of my professors, Dr. Mark Sidwell, was a researcher, and he loved to research church history, both national and internationally. And he had given us 20 or 30 topics to write our final paper on. It's like a 35-page paper, and we had to pick one of those topics. So I went up to Dr. Mark when we got that, and I said, hey, I see all these topics. I appreciate all those topics, but I know you're a researcher. Is there anything that you've wanted to research about American church history that you just haven't had the opportunity to yet? And he goes, yeah. He goes, you're from the OBF, right? And I was like, yeah. I said, I'd really like to know about the Ohio Bible Fellowship. He said, would you write us a paper on that? I was like, oh, man, I'd love to do that. And then I stopped stone cold in my tracks. I was like, where do I find resources? Because there's no library stuff on these dudes, and what do I do? And he goes, well, I'm going to give you permission to footnote everything by personal interview. He said, so you come up with questions and then you ask them and so we did that. It was a wonderful time. I spent time with 15 of the original 17 founding members of the Ohio Bible Fellowship. And I asked them all the same questions. And I just reported on the history, the philosophy, the progress, all that, and I handed in a paper. And it was a good experience. But these were the guys that my dad identified with. It's part of the Ohio Bible Mission. So the Ohio Bible Fellowship formed the Ohio Bible Mission, and that mission owned Camp Peniel in Mount Gilead, Fredericktown, Ohio. And that mission also planted churches in Ohio. Okay? And it became quite a substantial organization, and it still exists today, and we're still friends with these folks, although not part of the Ohio Bible Fellowship anymore. Okay? Late 80s and 90s, for us at Grace, were times of plateau and decline. Now this is in our present at that time. If you go back to 1948 and you pull out the attendance records, this is not a church growth seminar, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying our church attendance records look like a lot of people's church attendance. It looks like a heart monitor, right, over the years, right? And so we're still kind of experiencing that in the 80s and 90s. At Grace, even though my dad's a great teacher, even though my dad's he personally led the church in some pretty passionate corporate evangelism, door to door and bus ministry and that kind of stuff, we were still struggling. Dotting all of his I's and crossing all of his T's in his preaching. He was a tremendous Bible teacher, loved language. Kenneth Wiest and Kenneth Wuest's apprentice were his Greek teachers at Moody. He loved systematic theology. He loved history. Never had a mentor, but just loved those things. So we were well fed. It wasn't a problem of being fed. And we did evangelize as strongly as we could in a corporate way. We did come to a point in 90 where we couldn't pay our missionaries. It was a devastating time. It was about this time, too, that my dad was struggling with my older sister and my brother. They had walked away from the Lord. He had already offered his resignation once over my sister's lifestyle. And it was at this point he offered his resignation a second time because of my brother's lifestyle. And him having never been loved, his dad never told him one time that he loved him. Not one time. Neither did he tell us that. No matter how many times you told him that. So my dad had a rough upbringing as an old Middlefield farm boy, but nonetheless, he did a great job for what he knew on how to be a dad. And my mom, having been a second generation believer herself, she did a wonderful job too. But my dad was never mentored in how to balance time with ministry and family. And so he struggled with my older siblings. So this was a time of the offer of his second resignation, but it was coupled with my brother's lifestyle, and the church just didn't seem to be going anywhere. And he was doing all that he possibly could, right? Everything that he'd been taught, sticking, taking the right stand, teaching the right stuff, passionately involved in ministry, and he's just doing a self-analysis at this point. And obviously, I've been imbalanced. I'm losing my kids, and the church is struggling. We can't even pay our doggone missionary. He's just devastated, right? So he's just kind of done at this point. And this is the point where he starts to have some physical issues with his heart. So we'll just keep going. All right? He offered his resignation. The deacons said no. We understand the deacons were very sweet. They said, we think that's what the struggle of your kids is because we haven't been helping you spend more time with them. So they didn't want to lose him, so they rejected it. And my dad still did a pastoral evaluation, and he said, we're not evangelistic enough, so we need to do more with evangelism. The teaching, we're doing that, right? The equipping, we feel we're doing that. We need to go more. So back in that day, in our arena of education, we were taught that you revitalize a church by revitalizing the youth in the church. Go get the kids. Go reach the kids in the community. So we did that. In 1991, they hired me. Go figure, right? I had been there for 5 years, from 86 to 91, as a summer intern, just reaching youth in the community. And so this was the silver bullet back in the day. Go get the kids and you revitalize the church. Well, that seemed to work for a time, and worked is in quotes here because it really didn't. And the church grew, right? We grew because we assimilated some other people from other churches that didn't have youth groups. And man, we had the best, right? So I want my kids to have a program. And then we built a children's ministry, my wife and I. And then we got even more people from other churches, and we're like, this isn't what we wanted, but this is what's happening, right? So tithing went up. We paid our missionaries. We back paid our missionaries. We've ever not paid our missionaries since, but it didn't really work, okay? Though evangelistic, while maintaining an emphasis on teaching, we came to plateau and decline again. And that was time for my dad and I just to really do some sincere pastoral evaluation of what in the world was going on. Now, this was not a church growth seminar. I've already said that. Jesus saves. But what we realized is that he and I, neither of us were disciple makers. Right? He and I weren't even living the life that Jesus lived on earth, though we were buried in ministry. And we're going to talk about that the rest of our time together. We were taking a right stand. We're teaching the whole will of God. were evangelizing, though most of it was situational and corporate, while maintaining solid programs and facilities. And we weren't doing well. So we're doing everything we taught. We're doing it with a lot of hours and a lot of energy and a lot of prayer, and something's still not being done by the people or by us. And we were realizing all the ministry was primarily being done by us, the trained professionals, so to speak. Okay, so what did we do? We sought the Lord for wisdom. We repented of our sins as pastors. We did. I remember getting in my dad's office, and we say, Lord, something's wrong. If it's us, tell us. And he did, and it was. We realized the whole church was becoming like us, right? Because they loved us. And the Lord led both of us to Ephesians 4 to re-examine that pastor-teacher gift and its purpose. And really, it was this text that was the springboard for the whatever's happened in over 20 years here at Grace. Okay? What does it mean to equip the saints to do the work of service, the work of ministry? Well, I think the rest of the text explains that. And we thought as long as we could equip the people, preach them enough to get them busy living out their spiritual gift set in the local church, that was our job. And we're realizing that's only part of our job. Equipping the saints to do the work of the ministry, because that's one of 4 major gift passages in the New Testament, we thought, wow, we'll just apply this to them, every joint supplying per their spiritual gift. In other words, if you have the gift of helps and you want to mow, sweep, paint, clean, good, serve that way. If you have the gift of mercy and you would love to organize a hospital visitation team, right? Good. Let's go. We could organize that, right? If you have the gift of giving, we'll certainly let you organize, right? There's special ways you can do that, right? Whatever the gift was, we organized ministry so they could be busy about their gift. But then we started analyzing the verbiage of this text. And what were those individual people in the church to actually be doing? What were they to be doing? While they were busy in the doing of their gifts and they were faithful worshipers, we were not training our people because we weren't modeling it for them. To grow each other up into a fuller understanding of who Jesus Christ was. That's what the text says. We weren't equipping our people to help them mature one another, because we were taught that was our job. So we did our job. So we had a very busy but very unhealthy people. And we thought busy was healthy. And now we're realizing busy is never healthy. And that's why we're always doing this. Right? So this was the springboard text. So much more to add to this. But I'm just telling you our history and how God used this text. How are we going to now equip our people to shepherd each other? And that was a challenge. Because if people didn't have the pastor-teacher gift, they couldn't do that. And so now God, the Spirit's putting us back on our heels, we feel, challenging us with other spiritual gifts too. In other words, if I don't have the gift of mercy, then I don't have to be merciful. You say, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Well, just hang on with me here. If you follow it out loud, this is our story. If you think it's silly, raise your hand and say, I think that's bad logic. Don't use it again, and I won't be offended. Well, I don't have the gift of giving, so I don't have to give. That would be cool for a lot of people, right? I don't have the gift of help, so I don't have to help. I don't have the gift of teacher, so I don't have to teach. I don't have the gift of pastor-teacher, so I don't need to shepherd anybody. None of us think that out, talk that out, text me now, email me later, speak up now. To us, that was what we're going through. It's like, you know what? We need to be merciful. I don't have the gift of mercy. Personally, I don't have the gift of mercy. All right? Some people would say I do. I don't think I do. I definitely don't have the gift of giving. Thankfully, my wife does. Right? But all these things that I'm not, I still need to be. Right? I just might not be that entrepreneur at doing that the Spirit of God, by His manifold grace, makes some. So we're seeing in Ephesians 4 this responsibility to train our people in addition to serving one another by the grace of God per their gift to shepherd each other too. How do we do that? And really to us, this is the second part of the Great Commission. Teaching them to do what? Observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And who's the audience? Who's in the peanut gallery at that post-resurrection statement, the marching orders that Jesus gives His church? It's a lot of non-trained professional people. It's mostly people who would never go into full-time vocational work. We're assuming it's inclusive of many of the 500 people that Jesus appeared to, 1 Corinthians 15 tells us, after His resurrection. We're assuming it includes some of those people who were raised from the dead when the temple curtains torn. We know it includes 11 living apostles at that time, right? So we know that this could be a group of 500 to 1,000 people. And we know it includes some people that went on to be full-time ministers of the gospel, John, Peter, and maybe some others, but it's primarily given to people who would be members of the Church of Jerusalem. And they are to go and they are to together continue to observe. And that word observe is a powerful verb used in other places in epistolary literature. It's just It's a powerful verb, all right, of what that actually means. And so, wow, we've got a lot. So, for my dad and I, we have a lot of work to do. We had run out of gas. Our tank was empty, having done all that we were taught, and yet something was missing, and so we had a lot of work to do. So we really started to study this out, and I asked the deacons at that point if I could begin to look for a church somewhere in the United States that had a disciple-making emphasis in their ministry. They said yes, so we called a little over 300 churches. I found 2 churches, a little over north of 300 that we called, that said they had a disciple-making ministry. And simply what that will look like is if someone got saved through a church outreach, bus ministry, children's ministry, Christmas program, whatever, that they would be paired up with if it's a man, a deacon. If it was a woman, a deacon's wife, and they would be taken through one of 2 books on discipleship. Basics for Believers, or an old book called One by One. I think it's reprinted as something else now. Both still in existence. And so that was the most I had heard that anyone did with their people, and it was giving these newly saved people over to someone in leadership or their spouse to go through and study those books together. And then I would say, then what? And they said, well, they would be baptized, they would become a member, and they would be serving in the local church, and then we just kind of go. Okay? Certainly nothing wrong with any of these churches I called. Certainly nothing wrong with these 2 that were at least doing that. So I'm not throwing any under the bus because they were all us. I'm looking for a place that would do this because we're not. So this is an analogy. This isn't a criticism, okay? This is just us. We have a guy in our church. He's still in our church. He came up to me and he said, I have an old friend in Kansas City, Missouri, and I think he's part of a church that's doing what we're trying to figure out. So he put me in touch with him, Cliff's Notes. I flew down there to spend time with their outreach pastor and met with him on a Monday morning. And he said, just come tonight to our gymnasium and he said, you'll understand more if you see it. So I did, came, we met, he took me over to the side doors of the gym and opened up. And it's a full-size high school gymnasium, right? And it's full of church potluck tables, these 8-foot tables, 8 people at a table. And the gym's just wall to wall, these tables, and every seat's full. And with 8 people. And in between these people sitting at these tables were just the Bible and these Bible study books. Nothing to calm the acoustics in a gym. It was just loud. But it was a glorious noise. I mean, I stood at the door and I just started weeping. And then I looked over him and I said, is what's going on here what I think's going on here? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, everyone that sees it has the same response. That's exactly what he said. He said, everyone in this room is studying the Bible with someone that they've led to Christ in town. And if they haven't led someone to Christ in town yet, they've paired themselves up with someone else in the church to go deeper in the Word together until they do. And everyone, every Monday night, starts the study gym-wide in evangelistic prayer, Colossians 4, 2 and 3. Evangelistic prayer for their lost family members, relatives, co-workers, neighbors. So no one studies until they first pray evangelistically. And what I heard there and what I saw was a visual and an audible of a practical hands and feet of the Great Commission. You're going and you're observing. Ecclesiastically, we'll let the church do the baptizing. Right? But I saw people taking ownership of 2 sides at the tip of the spear of what the church is to be. Going and observing. And the pastors there were doing everything they could to train the people to shepherd each other, even though they didn't have the pastor-teacher gift. And we saw for the first time that which we thought we understood in Ephesians chapter 4 of every joint in the church supplying, growing itself up into an epignosis of who Jesus Christ is. Now, if this is going to continue to become a conviction in our hearts, we know how much work's involved with this. As Pastor Peter said, this is not the undoing of the church. We didn't do anything wrong, but what can we do better? This what can we do better question, that has to be prayed about, thought about a long time. Because if you're going to step out and do this, then you've got to be prepared to do it. But you have to understand this too. It takes so long to prepare to do this. And you realize how long it takes because it's so necessary, because you begin to realize that this is the perpetuity of the church. This is the way Jesus builds his church. We had lived decades building the church ourselves. I know Jesus builds his church, but the way I was taught in undergrad and grad school, my seminary work, especially in my CA courses, is you take your gift and you go. Right? And if you have a little bit of business sense about you and a little bit of money in your back pocket, you don't even have to invite the world into your church to be able to grow your church. So it's kind of haunting to us that maybe there's a lot of people in our church because of our influence, and maybe it's not Jesus building his church. But when you begin to understand this theologically, philosophically, you practically understand how much time, and then you understand it's like, oh wow, like if I die, what happens to the church? If I resign, what happens to the church? If pastor does the church know what to do? Right? But now, over 20 years later, right? If I breathe my last before we get into the first page, right? If all 4 of our pastors breathe their last today, our church knows what to do. They'll be fine. Right? I'm 54 years old, and I'm getting ready to leave because the next group has been discipled and shepherded, and they're ready to go. I'm excited I don't stay till 65 or 75 or 85 or 90 and then wonder who's next and wonder what's going to happen, right? When the pastor becomes a disciple maker, the people follow suit over time, and you start to realize what you'll hear for the rest of our time together, this phrase, unexpected God-intended blessings. The Spirit of God begins to blow wind in the sails of the obedience of disciple-making people, and He breaks the bread of their obedience under the perpetuity of what He is the head of. His own body. He said He would build it, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And He always will build it. I want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of His body building it for Him. I want to be part of His building and the way He builds. And I know that sounds profoundly elementary and simple, but it's very de-stressing. Okay? All right. So, any comments or questions about our history? Any comments or questions about Colossians 4? Little devotional thoughts we had at the beginning. All right? How many of you heard a few similar things from my dad's history to Grace Baptist's history to Grace Church of Mentor's history among all the personal, philosophical, and practical things we talked about? Was there any similarities that you've had in your past? Stands, twists, turns. There's a lot that's just what the church was to us for 4 decades or so. Okay? All right. So let's till up the soil of our minds, hearts here, a little bit more spade work through some questions. Okay? We all know this is true. Okay? Christ does build His church. He does build it in the world as we know it. And we want to talk about how. All right? We want to talk about how. All right? If I go too fast, just raise your hand and I'll know to go back. Or you can just yell, go back. I think we're going to have a lot of people skipping lunch and going to get one of those things at Walmart. How far away is Walmart from here? Ask away. It's good to see you again, by the way. Thanks. You look the same. Yep.
I have been looking through this Colossians, wrote down the outline,
Yep.
how there is enough Christ to go around in all of these aspects of ministry. And as I'm sure many pastors can understand, I mean, there's a refresh conference at Faith for a reason, because so many pastors are spending every ounce they have. And in a sense, it used to be a church of love. And if a man believes that he is giving every dollar of his time and energy to surviving, and a financial advisor says, you keep doing this, you're never going to actually make it financially easy to invest in the future. How does the man take what he feels he doesn't have another ounce of and invest further on into the future through making disciples?
He has to realize that he needs to obey, and he might not see the fruit of that obedience in his lifetime. You have to start somewhere. And that's okay, because he didn't waste his time for all those years, right? Like Pastor Peter said, you get very burdened. I just told you our history, to the point of resignation. But Thomas Rainer reported, a couple months ago, Southern Baptist Convention, 51% of the pastors have already written their resignations or are planning on writing them this year. That's just in that denomination. right? That's after COVID. But before COVID, a lot of that mindset still existed. We were it. It's not just resign, but it's like quit. I'd rather go scan groceries at Giant Eagle than do this. Right? It's a lot more simple just to mindlessly scan. Blip, 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 and go home. Right? But if it's God's will, God's grace is sufficient to encourage a man's heart to step out and begin to pray with his wife, with his leadership, about doing this together, because he realizes the way he's been trained to do ministry is pretty much put him on his own ecclesiastical island, because we did it all. And he should be refreshed by God's grace to invite these people in to pray about a new direction. And he should be refreshed by praying with them that he's going to do this together with them, not out in front of them, not from behind them, but from among them. And then when you know you have a flock that's willing to go, even if it's a portion, a morsel of your flock, with you side by side, you do ministry differently. You just do. I lived it. I watched my dad almost die, literally, offer his resignation twice, right? I lived this. Got to my wits' end myself, and looking all that's going on in new evangelicalism, looking what's going on in all historic fundamentalism, and realizing both sides have created their own attractional model in certain senses, right? And yet, I'm not responsible for them. I'm responsible for the us. What do we do? What do we do? And so, this is our story. But to your point, it's never too late to do right. That pastor realizes that he can't steer a parked car, but he has to understand, where in the world am I going to get the energy to do this? And I think it's found in prayer, and it's found in the inviting of people who are closest to you to help you figure this out. Because we were trained to tell. We were trained to teach. We were trained to preach. And we weren't trained. I wasn't trained to gather, to go with. I was trained to shepherd from out front. Just lead. This is what leaders do. Set your goals, set your vision, set your plans, set the schedule, get the programs going, clean up the building, go, go, go. Yeah, we got numbers. We got numbers. And some people were mercifully saved in the meantime, right? But then we still came to that brick wall, right? So it was always about the what next, right? Not who has this mandate been given to, not who do we get to do it with, right? And so I would say pray, and then invite people around you to learn this with you, not to tell it to them. I think there's a spirit-filled vulnerability that a pastor has that his sheep will realize. And then that enfleshes him to his sheep. And that's what you'll hear tomorrow. We did. We don't know what we've been doing. Well, you've got the degree on your wall. You've got 3 degrees on your wall. You've been doing this for over 20 years. We hired you to tell us what to do and how to do it. It's like, well, that's maybe the corporate world. But that's not the church, right? How does the church function? And so I don't want to lead out from in front of you anymore. I've ruined too many things. If it's bad, it's my fault. If it's good, it's God's fault, right? So we got to figure this out. I would rather do it with you than out in front of you. And that's what disciple making has become. It's become a with, right? It's become a we instead of the me. And we'll learn more of that as we go along. Did that help answer your question, brother? Yeah, so refresh It's good. I've been there, right? But I'll tell you what is refreshing. It is refreshing. Are you ready? And I'm not saying this for all you folks that are part of Ankeny. I'm meeting Dr. Tillotson for dinner this week. I'm not. Okay. Refresh could be necessary for a different reason if you're ecclesiastically refreshed 52 weeks a year. Because you have a flock of disciple-making people. So I'm just kind of saying this. I think those kind of opportunities would exponentially grow in number if we had more shepherds who were refreshed by doing this with their people, and they could go there not needing refresh. That's where you can truly get refreshed, is if you're coming in refreshed anyway. Right? Then refresh becomes the stem on top of the cherry, on top of the icing, on top of the 3 layers of cake. Right? Does that make sense? So that I'm just talking to you from I'm 54 years old. I've been at Grace Church of Mentor for 49 years. All right? 35 years full and part-time. Spoken, and this is just what God's done, right? Hundreds of places, lots of evaluations, just about every school you can think of, just taking a pulse out of a lot of different stuff. And what disciple making is the hardest thing in the world you're going to do. It's the most glorious, agonizing thing you're going to do. But it forms, it allows Jesus to build his church in a way that actually becomes incredibly refreshing in a new way for its shepherds. And we'll talk about that a lot over the next couple of days here. Okay? It's nice to not need to conference. It's nice to not need certain things because your sheep feed you so much because they're so used to feeding each other. The best pastor's conference I could ever go to is 4 times a week with my people, where pastors used to say, yes, all these 300 and some churches I called, most of them said, yes, we disciple, and I do it through my teaching and my preaching. That's discipleship. That's what they were taught. I was just taking notes, right? But when you have a church full of people who are learning because they're shepherding others, they're always feeding up to you. I'm learning more from our people. I swear to you, I will put my hand on my Bible and I will tell you, I am learning more from my people, theologically, philosophically, and practically, that I could learn in any pastor's conference, anywhere in the world, so I don't need them. I don't need them. I'm glad they're there. I go to them, but I don't need them. Does that make sense? I hope that doesn't sound like caustic or whatnot. It's just a different scenario now. I have a different flock. Years ago, we'd put 3 or 4 on the year and we'd put them in the budget because we had to have them. We had to have the theological download. We had to have the interface, right? We had to have the pre-podcast podcasts, right? We had to intellectualize, cogitate together, philosophize together, and now I'm doing that with my flock. My flock's uploading all that to me because we gave them the slack to do that with one another. And that's what we oversee. Feed the flock of God, that's what we are doing. And oversee it without compulsion, right? That's a power. Without compulsion, that's powerful. And unexpected God-intended blessing, now we're realizing we typically did oversee by compulsion. Now it's just kind of like, it's different. Is that a lunch chime? Am I missing something? Oh! Well, you are so kind to say that. I thought it was a beautiful lunch chime. Because I'm getting hungry. Just let it keep playing. It's actually kind of settling. Don't worry, please don't rush. It's very nice. Thank you. She could probably let that play the rest of the time. It's just kind of like peace. I'll cause the stress and your chime will cause the peace. Are you okay? Okay, good. That was a long question to a simple answer, or a long answer to a simple question, but it's just different now. You know, shepherding the flock, it's always a glorious agony. It's got its agonies. But we're truly understanding what disciple-making first century affliction and persecution is now. And now, in the past, we're realizing we caused a lot of it. It was self-inflicted, and we called it persecution and affliction, but it was really self-inflicted. But when Jesus builds his church, you really understand how painful true persecution is. But then you get to do it with your people. I was like, do we got enough insulin to go around here? Is everyone gonna be okay? All right. Brother, I love that ringtone. Whose is that? Oh, okay. No, that's okay. Like in my phone, each one of my kids have their own ringtone per their personality. And so we have an elder who's, it's like, you got to change this, Dave. The ringtone for his wife, like we'll be at a prayer meeting and his phone will go off. And the ringtone for his wife is that old Model T horn. It's like, it sounds like a donkey, but it sounds like a horn, right? I said, Dave, you got to change that. And he just laughs, and Barb laughs, and they got a great relationship. All right, enough for the comic relief. All right, here we go. All right, so this is true. We know that that disciple making, the Great Commission includes going and observing. We understand that. We understand now that it's our job to equip our people to understand this, how to live Christ's life now. But it does include going. In the going part of it, most of our churches would have understood, at least Grace Church of Mentor, Grace Baptist Church would have understood that we go institutionally, we go corporately. None of us have problems with children's outreaches and youth outreaches and Christmas and Easter and bus routes and maybe even door to door. None of us have trouble situationally handing out tracts on planes to our bankers, to our acquaintances. There's nothing wrong with any of that. At Grace, we haven't stopped any of that. But I would say at Grace now, we don't need any of that. Okay? But we still do it. We just don't need it. Right? Doesn't need to be part of our calendar. We'll talk to you about what our people, years later, after we started to see this become a reality, will tell you what they asked us to do. They asked us if they could do it, and that'll be at the end of tomorrow. Okay? All right. As far as our going is concerned, most people in our church would more readily embrace doing a VBS together or handing out tracts. In our neck of the woods, specifically at Grace, we had to have an annual personal evangelism class. We never had to have a class on how to do a youth outreach or a children's outreach together because we did it together. But why did we always have to have an annual personal evangelism class? Because that's the thing that's hardest for believers to do, right? It's hardest for people to do that. And we got that. And we realized that it was hardest for them to do that because my dad and I, we weren't modeling that. We weren't modeling that ourselves as disciple makers. All right? So here's a real quick question. Any foreign missionaries in the room? Or former foreign missionaries in the room? Headed? Where are you folks going again?
Buffalo, New York.
Oh, you're going to Buffalo to plant or to shepherd?
Church planters.
To church plant. Okay. Well, you're missionaries. You're evangelists. All right. So just kind of read this for a second and tell me if you think it's true or false. Understanding the proposition that we started with. So for a true first century kind of church, if we learned a new language, changed our diet, bought appropriate clothing, and did some on-the-job training in a new country, should we be able to thrive as a church in any culture? Now, from every foreign missionary that I speak to, it takes them anywhere between 5 to 10 years to fully absorb a language and just be able to speak it fluently. So assuming that this takes up to a decade of time, should we know here before we go there how Jesus builds his church? That's basically what we're asking. We think the answer is yes. So whether I am a disciple maker at Grace Church and God leads us to Hong Kong, I should know exactly what to do. right? If he leads me to Berlin, Joburg, South Africa, wherever he leads, I should not have to, other than do this, I should know exactly how Jesus builds his church. Now, when you go and you teach this theology, philosophy, and practice on foreign soil to American-born missionaries, okay, this can be heartburn for them because they were told to go be missionaries and plant according to a certain stripe or a certain ism or a certain something. Right? And since it worked in America, it's going to work there. Right? And they've created for themselves over there a little us for and no more. It's what's really odd to me is if they weren't taught to do that, I hope this doesn't become confusing. If they weren't taught to plant according to what their DNA was in the United States there, then what they were taught is to do disciple making there, which they never learned here. All right? I know plenty of missionaries that say, my pastor wants me to do on foreign soil what we never did back home. Win the national, train the national, plant with the national, have all the nationals go win and train and plant your church and then move on or come home. Okay? It seems to be the two extremes of missionaries that I've interfaced with over the years. Praise God for their faithfulness and their loyalty and their commitment. They're all wonderful people. But it's just our analysis. But for us, we had a gal, I can't remember her name, Jude. By the way, any of you here that have any questions about anything I'm saying, talk to her. She's really good at qualifying and explaining and knows the joys and agonies of disciple making and learned it with us for a lot of years. But remember that gal, I can't remember her name, from China? She resonated with the whole thing that we're doing, but she said her pastor was uncomfortable with it. Because her pastor wanted her to do church the way they did church there. And she goes, we can't. We can't. She goes, so going out into town and building redemptive relationships, she's over there as a missionary teaching English as a second language, part of a church plant. And she goes, the only way I can be part of Jesus building the church is exactly what you're saying. I have to go out and join a dog walking crew in Hong Kong or wherever she's at, right? I have to go out and get a safety partner to walk to the grocery, to keep each other safe. And I build relationships through these natural rhythms of life. And over time, as I love them and they love me back, the gospel becomes a conversation, right? Fascinating phenomenon that is, right? Right? That's the only way they can do it. I'm saying to you, that is the way. Anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. I taught a seminar for a mission agency that I'm on the board with in Europe. It was for all their European missionaries. Every country that they had Europe missionaries in, they came to Germany, and we spent a week together. We went through this material, and all the missionaries, to the missionary, said, that's not what we were taught. And I was like, well, I'm not trying to unseat what you were taught. That's not my point. They said, we know that's not your point. But we were taught to build our church institutionally and situationally. We were never taught to do it relationally, right? And it was a good conversation, right? So when I got back to the States, the pastors and their wives same thing happened in Argentina a few years ago. The pastors and their wives, they start texting me and saying, oh wow, we went and joined our local community chorus. We put our kids in Germany, Michael put his kids in the local children's orchestra. Right? One couple in Brazil that came to Argentina, they were 66, 67 years old, and they found a co-ed volleyball league for senior citizens. And it was travel. It was like club volleyball for old people. And they're sending me selfies with all their new friends and their volleyball gear. It was good weird. I introduce you to my new friends and right? I mean, but it's like, wow, this is so refreshing. So it is okay to actually not just reach out to our community, but be part of our community. Prayerfully, Colossians 4, 2-6, right? Is it that simple? It's like, yeah. And it's hard, but it's that simple. Nonetheless, we'll talk more. I don't know how we got on that. Right? All right, comments or questions on this? We can talk through it, piece it apart later. Remember that paper I did on the Ohio Bible Fellowship? All 15 of the pastors that I interviewed said, and by the way, the OBF churches now for over 20 years have had a pattern of decline, right? So remember, we preach the whole counsel of God. We take a right stand. We do situational and corporate evangelism, right? Okay? This is another topic of conversation. You know, one of my friends in that arena says, well, you just have to understand, Tim, God closes healthy churches. Now, I suppose God can do what he wants. He's God. But as I understand the word, I don't understand that. That's something that is a brain teaser for later, maybe over lunch or dinner. Does God close healthy churches? But all these men, all 15 of them, in separate interviews said the same thing. Our church is struggling, and it always will be struggling because the world is becoming a darker place. We could all put a little few Bible verses on that, right? That's easy. I understand that. But this is what fascinated me the most is the second bullet here. Our church is declining and not growing because the Christians in our church are becoming more worldly. As a younger pastor, when I did this paper, I'm just sitting there listening to all these guys that are in their late 60s, 70s, and one in his 80s, and I'm thinking, I don't understand that. Because these guys in the Ohio Bible Fellowship, they were pulpiteers. They were the great expositors, right? They were in our neck of the woods, a handful of them were like the Chrysostums of our day. And yet all of them said their flocks were becoming more worldly. So something didn't connect with me on that. And I knew that the stands on biblical separation they had taken on their past, they had emptied out sections of their church when they would take a stand against this particular matter of worldliness, or they would take a stand against this particular Christian college or seminary because of a stand that they would take in. And if there were few people loyalty to those things or those institutions, they would get up and walk out, right? I get that. I understand, number one. Number two, I'm still working on that. Because I don't know. Anyways, we'll talk more about it, all right? So that's true of our neck of the woods. So what's your history? Again, it's not a church growth seminar, but what about growth, plateau, and decline? Have you seen your church grow? When you define the growth as a result of institutional, situational, or personal disciple-making efforts, right? Before the pandemic, I believe it's Jim Stump, he did some work with the Barna Group, and he said that 93% of American churches are in plateau or decline. Okay, 93%. He said of the 7% that are growing, 5% at pre-COVID, 5% were megachurch philosophy. Now, I think we all know in this room that megachurch has nothing to do with size. It has everything to do with philosophy. Okay? Because of the philosophy, they get big, but they get big because of the philosophy. Okay? And he said 3%, 3% of the churches, he said 93, 5, right? What is 93 and 5? My math. 2% of the churches were growing because they were disciple-making churches. In other words, churches that really understood the lane of the Great Commission. That was their analysis of their study. That 2% of American churches were growing because they were disciple-making in their emphasis. That's pre-COVID. So what did COVID do to the 93% that was in plateau or decline? Apparently, from Thomas Rayner of the Southern Baptist Convention, speaking for their neck of the woods, right? 35 to 45% of the membership of the 93% of those churches is not returning to church. So if they were in plateau or decline before COVID, where are they at now? And then we talked about the percentage of their pastors, and that's not to throw that convention under the bus. This is analysis of a pretty large segment of churches in our country, right? What's happening now that their pastors want to write their resignations, right? What happened to mega churches in your neck of the woods during COVID? Just tell me. I'll tell you what happened to the ones in ours. What happened to that 5% of growing, bustling churches in your neck of the woods? Have you guys had a chance to analyze any of that yet?
A large portion of them in our area, they are still stressing online ministry because that's the only way they're reaching half the congregations.
Yep.
People coming back is extremely slow, so they've shifted almost a large majority of their focus to strictly streaming online, even how they're advertising and doing outreach now, because they lost that portion in their church. Now they're trying to shift their whole ministry to focus on ministering that way instead.
Same in our area. There's one church, probably the biggest mega church in Ohio, is out in northwest Ohio in the Toledo area. And the same thing. It's a stage 4 cancer. Right? And they were, you guys know how they're not just franchising their churches, but they're satelliting their churches. The church in Northeast Ohio is actually developing like 6D technology where the pastor of all those satellites can actually appear on the stage as a person while he's preaching. Right? But that shadow of a person, this 4D image of a person, this hologram of a person, is preaching primarily to an empty room. This hologram is preaching to many, many more people online. It's interesting. That's happening in our neck of the woods too. Anything else that you guys have heard? Yeah.
This is just kind of a
Sure.
not random question, but I understand institutional and personal deception. Can you explain situational?
Yeah, situational would be just like God burdens your heart to hand a tract to someone at the gas pump or a bank teller, someone at Walmart. God does that, right? Yeah, I was on a flight last night, and every flight, I don't seek to be an evangelist on every flight because I think that can be like really rude for some people. If they want to sleep, let them sleep, right? But last night, this couple was on my flight from Cleveland to Chicago, and they had just gotten married the day before, and they wanted to tell me everything about their wedding day. So they're pulling out their phones, showing their pictures. I was like, dude, just enjoy each other. You know, you're starting your honeymoon. They're showing all these pictures, and then they wanted to talk sports, and they knew we were from Mentor, and I guess the husband had played against my sons in basketball at one point, and I was like, oh, cool, you know. So it was a thing, and it led to a gospel. This kid grew up Mennonite and had a gospel testimony, and she grew up Catholic, and so they talked through the tensions of what that was for their families, and we got out. It was a short flight, but we got off the plane exchanging numbers, and we'll have an opportunity for the future. That's situational. Yeah, and I'm all for Holy Spirit prompted situational. So when I talk about doing evangelism together, or just those situations, I have no problem with any of that. I still do that, but we were doing both of those at the expense of owning personal disciple making. So that's and personal evangelism classes for us were just the go part. It wasn't, what's my responsibility to do the observing part, to do the shepherding part. So even our personal evangelism classes were all about the go and not about the observe, and then not about the together. All right? So this is what I was taught in my CA courses in my undergrad. Look, have good programs, have excellent facilities, and have a quality staff. This is 3 points taken from a lecture that one of my professors gave. Is there anything wrong with that? No. And so we did it. All I'm saying is it's not enough, right? But that becomes the pledge of allegiance of a young pastor if he's got some administrative wit about him and some business sense to him. That makes all the sense in the world, right? So that became my passion. When I hear that from my professor, he's a great guy, great material. We did that, right? If you can do all things excellently, I think that's the final principle of Philippians 1:11. Love leads to knowledge, and knowledge discernment, and discernment to excellence. If we can do it, great. But then that comes down to capacity. So every church's size is going to be depending on the skill set of the pastor. We'll find that analysis tomorrow. That doesn't really flesh itself out well in Great Commission work, right? Because what happens if that pastor's gone? We have a very, very large church. It's not a mega church in our area. If I said the guy's name, you would know it. He's all over your radios. Great preacher. Friends with his secretary, and I said, so if his plane goes down in a crash, God forbid, and he's gone, what happens to your church? And she goes, 40% leave. This is his secretary. 40%. I said, does he know that? I said, oh, yeah. Well, who's the next man up here? We don't know. We don't know. Right? This particular pastor is on an annual contract. Right? I know one of his leaders. Every December 30th, he signs a new contract for the next year. Why? Because in that contract, there's a certain amount of weeks, it's north of 20 weeks a year, that he wants to be gone to speak at other places. Right? How many of you could be gone from your church? Even 10 weeks a year. Right? But they know the money he brings in. It's a business model. There's nothing wrong with it. I think I could personally shoot some holes in that ecclesiastically, but that's none of my business. It's not my church, right? But, they have to keep him on, and he wants to renew that contract every year so everyone knows that this is his expectations. Right? Okay. He's got great programs and excellent facilities. He's got a quality staff. He's got a very wealthy man in his church. It gives him an open checkbook. It gives this pastor's wife an open checkbook to remodel any part of the church any time of year she wants. That's a neat setup. Anything wrong with that? No, you wish you had it. I know you do. Right? I can't call it wrong. That's just the setup. It's a great model. If you understand American church, right? Wife gets to be the decorating diva with an open checkbook from this dude and one person. You know how efficient that is? Not forming all of you wish you wouldn't have to form decorating committees. You know you do. You know you just wish you could call the shot. What a beautiful situation that is. But anyways, what's next? What's the perpetuity of the church? Right? And I know this guy well enough. I know that it's got to be a concern on his heart. You can't preach what he preaches and not have that be a concern on your heart. That was a concern on our heart, and we're not him. We're nowhere close to that size and an influence. But what is the perpetuity of the church? Nothing wrong with these things, but I think we obviously know that there's not enough. Okay? In your history, I'm just asking you to ask these questions because we had to ask these questions of ourselves. If we weren't growing, what were the reasons why? Were we playing the blame game? Were we saying that we weren't growing because we didn't have the programs, facilities, or staff? Were we saying we weren't growing because our church had some previous formal issues in town? Was there someone in our church that people knew as a member of our church that had a bad reputation in town? Is there a former child molester in our membership? Right? Is there a former well-known drug dealer now converted in our membership that people don't get conversion, and so they just know he's there, and so that church is that church with that guy. That happened to us in our church, all right? Our Lake County, Ohio's number one cocaine dealer got saved, right? He had left to go to Arizona to run away from the authorities. Right? His girlfriend, while he was out there, got saved. When he came back to Ohio to visit her, she won him to Christ. Well, now this dude, right, this couple is at Grace, and it became a thing out there. Oh, he goes to your church. Well, all right, let me qualify, right? There's all kinds of things, there's all kinds of reasons why, and they may be objective, very real reasons as to why we thought Jesus would not help us or not build his church anymore. And this is a topic for more conversation later. I'm just asking you maybe to ask, we asked ourselves, is there any excuse out there as to why Jesus would decide not to build his church anywhere? Right? So my mind goes to Revelation 2 and 3. What was the evaluation of the churches, the 7 churches? Right? So you fine-tooth comb through there why Jesus was going to remove the lampstand of influence. And you say, okay, yeah, we analyze this, and this. I think we're okay. I think we're healthy in that regard, right? As long as those issues are dealt with and taken care of. I suppose, with a church in Western Columbus, the first pastor embezzled money. The second pastor had an affair. The third pastor, this is similar to a church down a mile from our church in Mentor, had some issues with immorality with underage kids in the church. And at that point, what do you do if you're going to go in there and be the next pastor of that church? What are you taught to do? You certainly got to change the name. You definitely got to let everyone know this is under new ownership, right? Or you got to sell the building if anyone wants to buy it because they know the darkness that was there, right? And then you want to move to a different part of town and rebrand. Right? I get all that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. And it might be wise in some situations to do that. But for churches that have not gone through that extreme of history, circumstance, what excuses are we making as to why maybe Jesus isn't building? And then do we really understand what building his church is? Is it having a budget that needs to be met at a certain amount? Does it really have anything to do with average weekly attendance charts that we keep? What are the things that we worry about, that we watch on our dashboard of ecclesiastical success that we have to hit in order to know whether we're healthy or not? Is that really a proper temperature to take of whether Jesus is really building his church or not? So all these kind of things we talk through, but nonetheless, we'll just kind of narrow them down to personal responsibility in Great Commission work. But old blood, what's old blood? This is not old people. This is why I have it in quotes. These are just inflexible people. Right? I just have some stubborn people in my church. The church is never going to grow because the church has it's really a family church. It was started by a guy and his family, and then his family grew, and 60% of the church has the same last name, and they're set in their ways this way. And the church is never going to be what God, because it's got to be their way. I know that's a thing in some places in our area. Whatever the issue is, that's inflexibility, and Jesus will never build his church when it's full of people that are inflexible, right? Stubborn, stiff-necked. Well, we keep persevering through these things too, right? And we really never really know how those things are going to work out until we take ownership of disciple making as leaders, a little bit at a time. These are the things we talked about that wear pastors out, right? They used to wear all of us out too. And while they still are hard, they don't bring us to our knees anymore because we have such encouraging people around us. Anyways, if your church is leveled off in growth, what are the reasons for it? And this is not me asking you. This is just a question we asked ourselves, and I put a "your" on it. What were we thinking why we were? And an analysis. It was a good question to ask yourself, we think too. Okay? This is something that we asked ourselves too. Okay? This was a principle I took from The Trellis and the Vine. I don't know if you've ever read that book or not. Is it generally true that children become like their parents? Do students, given enough time, become like their professors? Do citizens over time become like their president? And so do churches over time, given enough time, become like their pastors? Their analysis, and I would agree with it, I would say that this analysis is generally true. We had kids that we sent off to colleges from our church, and if they had several classes with one particular professor, particularly in the area of theology, they would come back to us a different kid. It's like, okay. So you're 9 months a year away underneath the same guy for 4 years. You're going to come back a different kid if you really like and jive with the professor. Right? Especially if they obviously go into a Christian college that has a little bit different twist on some ecclesiastical things, theological things. I mean, my children are a ton like me, and I'm a lot like my parents. I think we had a huge moral shift in the foundation of our country under President Obama. That was 8 years. This last president, we had a huge, before this president, a huge dispositional shift in the foundation of our country in 4 years, right? Maybe forever not to be corrected. Who knows? So for us at Grace, we took ownership of the fact that our people had become like us, so we really had nothing to preach to them. We had nothing to bring them to conviction about because we had no ground to stand on because we were not ourselves disciple-making people. Okay? By the way, my dad died long before, but in the beginning days of what this was becoming. And he was thrilled that it had at least started. So back to your question, because I'm very, 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 very sympathetic to older pastors. I mean, 1 Timothy 5:1 and 2 is huge for me. It always will be. I'll never throw an older pastor under the bus at all. We all stand on their shoulders, whether you agree with what they did or didn't do. They generally did a great job. But that's the point, whoever that pastor is, if he could just gather people around him to figure it out together, and it can be refreshing to them nonetheless. All right? All right. Who grows the church? This is a little section in your notes you can read on your own. This is a story of a former professing believer, now turned atheist, as to his analysis of the church. And he looks at 2 growth models of the church that you can read on your own. We won't take time to do that today. But I think it's fascinating, and we put it in your notes because I think his observations are pretty astute. Right? They're pretty astute. As a matter of fact, I think you can get it read in 1 minute. Let's just take a minute of silence and read it, okay? And then you can tell me what you think of it. All right, any thoughts or questions? You kind of get his direction. What's he saying? Let's just talk about it for a second. What's he saying? What's his experience of observations of how churches are grown in his neck of the woods? Man's effort? Glitz and glamour. Okay. Business tactics. Okay. I mean, is he wrong in what he's saying? I mean, we understand he writes from a perspective of an atheist, but can you shoot some holes in it?
I think his definition of relying on God is people sitting back in a chair and doing nothing, just assuming God will do the growth, even though they're being disobedient and
Yeah. Have the programs and it's somewhat of a, and it hurts me to say this because I don't like the phrase, let go and let God kind of thing. Yep. Anything else you took from that? Yeah, go ahead, bro.
Well, I just think that, what he views as growth and what God would view as growth are two different things.
Yeah.
He's looking at it very superficially. We have a big church in our town, and over 1,500 people that gather
Wow.
on services. And I once asked a genuine born-again believer who attended there, what percentage of that group do you think are truly born-again? And he said 20%. I think he was overly pessimistic, but still. So what is the size of that church? Is it 1,500 or is it the 20% of the 1,500?
Yeah.
So again, what does God view as growth? What does God view actually as who makes up that church?
It's a sobering question for all of us, right? I mean, Spurgeon, in his mid-50s before he passed, thought that over half the tabernacle church was not, they were goats and not sheep, he said. So we're really coming down to living the life of Christ, right? His last words being our first command. Who's really doing that? And so his observations of the church growth, I think, are accurate, but they're certainly not what God means, when Jesus means when he says, I will build my church. But what's fascinating to me is an unsaved guy can actually analyze the growth patterns of American churches, and he's not wrong, even though that's not God's growth, right? But anyways, I just thought it was just a book I was reading and thought I'd put it in there. All right, what disciple making is not. All right, we just want to kind of run through these things real quickly. These are things that we came up with at Grace. Learning over the years. Disciple making is not a program. Disciple making is not merely teaching. It's not merely reaching. It's not merely discipleship. It's not bound up in a volume or a class. And its responsibility is never placed upon parachurch organizations. These are just our lists of knots. Right? It's not a program. It's an individual lifestyle. It's not merely teaching, because what we realized at Grace was those who had the gift of teaching and absorbed themselves with preparation to do that teaching would say that their teaching was their disciple making. Right? I am a disciple maker because I teach God's word. Okay? And what I'm saying is it's not merely that. We're not throwing any of these things aside or under the bus or saying they're unnecessary. We're just saying it's not merely that. Right? That teacher has to own more. That's all we're saying. The same thing with the person that's got the gift of evangelism in your church that has never met a stranger that's given the gospel to everyone they meet. They have to understand that that's not merely disciple making. Well, I'm telling people about Jesus all the time. Okay, good. But, right? I had a guy, he's this big-time evangelistic guy, and in college, we would go out every weekend and we'd give the gospel out. And this guy would come back every Monday into our particular theology class, and he would talk about how many people came to know Christ through the street preaching that weekend in Simpsonville, South Carolina. We had 30 people this week, we had 40 people this week, 15 people this week, and I don't know, it almost sounded like there were notches in their belt, so to speak. And I always used to sit, I was a young guy, I didn't know diddly back then. I still feel like I don't know anything now, but I would listen to that and was like saying, so I would think to myself often, and then I finally spoke up and he didn't like me anymore. I used to think, well, where are they going to go to church? Who's going to shepherd these people? Well, that was his gift of evangelism, I guess. So one time I just said, so did you hand them like an address of where to go to church yesterday? Oh, that's none of my duty. God will lead him. Cool. That guy, my point is that guy had done his job. He had done his disciple-making job. And people in our churches that have the gift of evangelism, they could feel that they're doing the same because they're always handing out tracts. They're always giving the gospel, and that's merely not disciple-making. Okay? It's not sitting down and going through one book with somebody. Those two churches we talked about earlier, among the ones we called, that's okay, but it's not merely that either. It's good. It's more than most. The church in Missouri that we found doing that Monday night thing in the gym, they had 9 books that they had written. And it took most of their people an average of 2 years with their new convert to get through those books. So I would tell you this, what we'll learn after lunch, is that disciple making is not merely taking 2 years to observe whatsoever things I've commanded you after you've reached someone and then letting them be absorbed into the function of the church. Okay. Most churches aren't even at 9 books over 2 years, right? Anyways, it's not just merely study. You could put next to that bullet, it's not merely discipleship. The parenthesis there, and I'm not throwing any of this under the bus. I'm just saying it's not merely small groups, right? Small groups have morphed over the last 30 years, right? And every time they start and they stop, they're resurrected with a new purpose, right? For me personally and my church experience, we're on round 3 of repurposing small groups. And every time we repurpose this concept of small groups, it seems to want to inch closer to discipleship, to the point where small groups now are called discipleship in a lot of churches. This is just an analysis. It's not a criticism, okay? But what's the function of those individuals in that small group unto the function of that small group? What's the function or what's the why of the leader of that small group? Right? What's the why of the leader of that small group? And is the why of those following the leader in that small group a disciple-making why? So then maybe we realize if we answer that question, that a different kind of small group branches out. And maybe that small group doesn't have a specific number to it. Maybe it doesn't have 5 or 10 or 15 or 20. Maybe God tells us what those numbers should be in those small groups as we do disciple making together. Or maybe if we're going to have small groups, maybe we're able to organize those small groups among a bunch of people who are already disciple makers. So when they do get together, that small group can exist in a short period of time on a particular subject in which those already disciple-making people need to be strengthened in that particular theology or philosophy of church life. And then they could break out as disciple makers and keep doing their disciple maker things, only with a little bit more spiritual muscle. Okay? Nonetheless, I think we had to be very, very careful because we had small groups. We're in the 3rd phase of small group, but our 3rd phase looks nothing like our 1st and 2nd. And we'll explain that later. It's just not merely that, okay? It's not bound up in a volume or a class that's kind of connected, and that it's certainly never placed upon parachurch organizations. Unfortunately, there's a lot of schools and institutions that have figured out disciple making before the church has. And they teach it to their students who never learned it in their churches. And I say unfortunately because it's the church's marching orders, not the parachurch or marching orders. I'm thankful that God has been merciful to teach young people that in time anyway. So I'm thankful that that's happening. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, but disciple making is not merely learning that from a parachurch organization. I was at my alma mater a few years back, and I got on campus for a speaking engagement, and there was banners all over. There was the theme for the year, right? It was the discipleship theme. So all of the dorm leaders, all the hall leaders, and all the prayer group leaders had been trained by the staff on what discipleship was, and they had the curriculum laid out for the whole year of what each small group, dorm, and then what the school was going to learn about discipleship together. And when I sat down with the president of the university, he goes, I know you guys are trying to figure this out at Grace, and you guys, we really love your emphasis there. I'm sure you love the emphasis of what we have here this year. And I said, hey, I think it's great. And I said, but wouldn't it be wonderful, you know, if the kids already knew it before they got here, so you didn't have to do it, so that you guys could focus on something else? And he goes, I never thought about it. He said, we're just trying to minister to these kids what we feel they need. I said, yeah, praise God for that. I think that's awesome, you know. I said, but wouldn't it be great if they knew it before they got here, right? So the next meal appointment I have is with the dean of students. And he said, oh, don't you think the theme here is really cool? Because I know you guys are having this emphasis. I think it's really good. I said, but I asked him the same question. Wouldn't it be wonderful if kids knew this before they got here? And he just put his fork down, and he put his hands on the table. He came over the table, and he goes, yes. Yes. And he said, Tim, have you ever heard of what a MASH tent is? I was like, yeah. I used to sneak and watch MASH against my parents' will when I was a kid. Did you ever watch the program? Yeah, if you did and you didn't want to raise your hand because you don't want people to think you're carnal, I get it. Right? I had to sneak to watch it. There was some things that were certainly not appropriate on that show. But a MASH tent was a tent in the Korean War where they would bring the wounded. It was a triage tent, right? If they're dead, they're toe tagged, right? If they're close to dead, you work on them first, and then all the way down to, that guy just lost his hand, but he's tourniquet, he's fine. We'll get to him in a little bit. It's a triage tent. And he goes, Tim, I said, yeah, I kind of was remembering back to the MASH program, and to answer his question, I said, yeah, I think I know what a MASH tent is. He goes, our incoming freshman class every year, we have to grow our MASH tent by closing down departments of education in the school so we can pay for it to be enlarged. He said the wounded coming in here in our freshman class every year is getting larger and larger and larger. He said we're laying off people, closing departments to the millions of dollars to make this MASH tent bigger, hiring more Christian counselors, giving kids more carved out time out of their regular studies to have to be counseled in some things that are just dark. Right? Folks, that was 15 years ago. So he says, yes, I wish they would have known disciple making before they got here in their homes, modeled by their pastors. Right? What strength are we being given? We're not. And he said, something's got to change. And I just really appreciated his transparency. You know, it was really, really helpful. A little discouraging, but really, really helpful. And then I had other lunch meetings that week with people on staff, and independently they were just pouring out their hearts saying, something's got to give. Something's got to give. You know, something's got to give. But anyways, we all know that. But nonetheless, that's why I put this on here. I added this bullet a handful of times after I had done the seminar, because I really applaud parachurch organizations for doing what churches haven't done but I'm saying it should not be done by them first. Okay? All right. And disciple making is not exclusively bound to a one-on-one relationship. We are going to start with a historical analysis of, I think that's part of a proper hermeneutic, right? There's a historic hermeneutic, there's a cultural hermeneutic, there's a linguistic hermeneutic, and everything that goes into your hermeneutic. We're going to study that after lunch today. And it's the hermeneutic starts off with at least a one trying to win a one and train a one. It starts off there, but it doesn't exclusively have to stay there. So I put that on here just because later, because a lot of people are saying, oh, you're that church that has one-on-one discipleship. I was like, you heard the first part of the theology. You didn't listen to the rest of it. Okay. Jesus had 12, and one of those was rogue, so one wasn't his reality. Right? So it's not a numbers thing. It's an understanding of a lifestyle. Okay? And it's not primarily being discipled by someone outside your church. This is big because a lot of Christians really want to know what disciple making is and be discipled by somebody. And if it's not going to be provided in their church, they'll go look for it. They'll find it somewhere. But I think God's designed the local church to be able to shepherd itself. Okay? If someone comes into Grace Church of Mentor and they've been shepherded by someone in another church for a long time, I totally respect that. And when they come into Grace, over time, though, I would expect them to fall under the shepherding of somebody at Grace. Right? Not a hatchet, but just over time. Right? A lot of people in our church that have come from other churches and they've never been discipled, and they're in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they're craving someone to shepherd them and to be trained how to do the same. Right? So that's good. There's a lot of people in my neck of the woods where we grew up where pastors were discipled by someone outside their church primarily through listening to sermon series. And so pastors in our church, they would have their own file drawers of sermons on some type of format, right? And they'd have their own sermons, and then they have another favorite pastors of their sermons. Certainly nothing wrong with that, but that pastor's sermons from another church in another place would be that person that discipled them. So pastor teachers have set themselves up to not be shepherded by someone in their own church, and I don't think that's correct. Okay? I get sheep are going to find to be fed somehow, but I'm just saying we're going to try to prove that the sufficiency of feeding should be in our churches, our local churches. So like our sheep should be well fed enough by each other to the point where they don't need to depend on someone else outside them. Okay? You say, well, that sounds awful like fortress building, and sounds like you're reinstitutionalizing the church, and that's not it. If it sounds like that, I apologize. That's not it at all. But I'm a big local church guy, and I believe these marching orders were given to the church, right, globally to be fleshed out locally. Okay? And that's how we saturate our Jerusalem first, and then Judea, Samaria, then uttermost parts, right? All right, what disciple making is, and I think we'll go to lunch, right, Pastor? Oh, my word, it's 12:25. We're a half hour late. Your ladies are awfully wise. Okay. I'm used to a clock back there. My people wisely put one right where I could see it. And they haven't caught eye. Oh, mercy. So I apologize. I was going to be done by noon here. Okay. This is what disciple making is. These are, I think, on purpose chosen words. Normative local church, individual responsibility that God the Spirit empowers as Christ builds his church. It is each saint shouldering the responsibility to spiritually reproduce themselves. It is the commitment of a life to another life for life. We'll see that after lunch. And it requires that the pastor lead the way. He be the chief disciple maker. If the pastor is not personally the most active, then what can we assume? If we're going to go back, does the church become like its pastor? Do children become like their parents? Students like professors? This is true. We found this to be true. Okay? Our people weren't because I wasn't. Okay? And we'll get to this after lunch. We're just going to take one more look at programs contrasted to disciple-making relationships, and you guys will see the similarities there, and you'll say, okay, this is why programs can't build the church, but relationships Jesus uses to build his church. And we'll make that quick analogy, then head on into better stuff, okay? All right, Pastor, thanks for your attention. And first 2.5 hours went by fast, I hope. We'll keep moving.
Okay, can we pray for lunch here and then head down? I think we can do that. We have, maybe your church has the same thing. We have 2 funeral meals, one cold, one hot, right? And we do both of them, we do excellent. Our ladies do excellently. And so when we were talking to the deaconesses about, doing this, they said, how about our funeral meal? I said, awesome, I love our funeral meal. And so I don't know about your church, but we love our funeral meal. So you're having a funeral meal today, and you'll enjoy it. Yes, Robin? Yeah, we have restrooms right up here, but also downstairs. The men's are right down when you go downstairs. The ladies is on the other side downstairs, so feel free, ask questions if you need to. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll go down and enjoy. Heavenly Father, thank you for the instruction we've received, and thank you for a clear look at what our responsibility has always been for these 2,000 years. And sometimes we as churches have gotten in the way of your great commission, and help us to clear the way so that you can do your work through us. Thank you for the fellowship we can enjoy around the tables, and thank you for the ladies that have poured so much time and effort into this, and we thank you for their good ministry, and we pray it in Jesus'